I don't want to take up too much time with introductory remarks of my own, other than just to say thank you to the organizers of this event for putting together such a great program, and to the foundation for making the event possible. But I will dive right in. My name is Danielle Johnson. I'm from CNA Corporation in Washington, D.C., but I just want to make it very clear that this is independent research. It's not CNA research. So, what was the inspiration for looking into psychological war trauma in Ukraine? Well, for me, it was seeing a lot of headlines like these in the Western press. If this slide looks a little overwhelming to you, that's cool, because it's overwhelming to me too. As you can see, there have been a lot of reports since the war began in 2014, claiming that Ukraine is about to face a crisis, or perhaps is already facing a crisis of PTSD, of various forms of psychological war trauma. And the emphasis, if you read through these headlines, is that Ukraine is really ill-prepared to handle a crisis as soldiers return from the ATO. A lot of these reports are from journalists, often Western journalists that have gone that have talked to people starting programs, or that have gone to the East themselves and talked to soldiers. And there's really a couple of things that they emphasize. One is stigma. A lot of these reports talk about Soviet stigmas against mental health care and about asking for psychological help, and also gender norms, a fear of asking for help because it goes against traditional conceptions of masculinity. And the other emphasis in a lot of these articles is a lack of resources in Ukraine. It's a country that's been at peace for a very long time. There was no real need to develop the infrastructure for crisis psychology, for dealing with combat stress. So before I dive into the results and the questions that I'm asking, just wanted to talk a little bit about why we should care about this, why this is more than just a Ukraine's issue or an individual's issue or a family's issue. Well, first of all, there's a lot of public health consequences to various forms of psychological war trauma. This is everything from substance abuse among veterans to unsafe sex, which can potentially spread diseases, to overeating, and then there are costs in dollar terms as well, like, for example, lost productivity when veterans cannot function and work. There is a lot of research, a body of research that's grown out of Holocaust studies on the intergenerational transmission of trauma, looking at how one generation's trauma really can be passed on to the next. So it just kind of keeps going and cycling through time. And the children of veterans, of people that have experienced trauma, can really have profound effects in their own lives. There's also really clear implications for psychological war trauma for attitudes towards justice and reconciliation. So when we're looking at a country that's at war, we have to be thinking about eventual conflict resolution and trying to develop a sustainable peace. So if the way that people are experiencing the war, the way that they're dealing with their trauma, is going to affect how they feel about reconciling with groups that they may be at war with or that they may have differences of opinion with, then we really need to think about how to address their trauma in the best possible way now, thinking towards that sustainable conflict resolution in the future. Well, how do we address trauma then? The way it's happening in Ukraine right now and in many other parts of the world is that a lot of time and energy and money is going into programs on psychosocial rehabilitation of veterans. And I just want to be clear that this is different from psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is dealing with war or violence-affected populations in more of a short-term sense, really trying to make sure that they have the resources that they need to kind of function and get themselves going again immediately. This is looking more towards longer-term reintegration of veterans back into civilian life. And there are international programs, international NGOs that have come to Ukraine that are working in partnership with Ukrainian groups. There are grassroots Ukrainian groups that started, many of them on the Maidan. And then there are a lot of diaspora efforts as well, again, partnering with actors on the ground in Ukraine to address trauma, veterans' trauma, and there's all kinds of different programs. There's even dolphin therapy in Venetia, which is pretty awesome. But there's canine therapy, there's art therapy, there's various forms of counseling, lots of different approaches, and really the goal is to ease the symptoms of the veteran and allow them to integrate back into their life, or the life that they want once they've come back from the war. So who is responsible for dealing with trauma? Well, is it really all these programs and civil society and international NGOs? The problem that this kind of framework that we've been thinking about trauma in Ukraine, the problem this raises for me is that there's a whole angle we're missing, and that's the community angle. there is a wide body of scholarship. You can find it in political science, you can find it in anthropology, you can find it in sociology, psychology, saying that there's a real community role to play in helping not just veterans, but any victims of trauma overcome their experiences. And the community can be conceptualized as sort of your individual social network. So the people that you interact with on a daily basis, your friends, your family, the people in your town, in your community. But then it's also the broader institutions with which you interact. So for a veteran, for example, that might be the ministry that they need to go to get their combat veteran status. Or it might be the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, which is putting out art exhibits. There's lots of different institutions embedded in a social context that is affecting the way that veterans' experiences are mediated and the ways in which veterans' experiences are understood by the rest of the society as well. So when we think about community, we're thinking about those individual social networks and that broader institutional context. And the literature, the interdisciplinary literature, says that the community needs to provide both recognition and restitution to these veterans. Recognition means the community needs to acknowledge what they have experienced, why they have been harmed, and who has harmed them. And restitution means that the community needs to take some kind of action to assign responsibility for that harm and to do something to actually fix that harm. So we're talking a lot about easing the symptoms of victims through all these psychosocial reintegration programs, but we've heard nothing about kind of the community role. And is there a gap between these programs, these mental health programs, and this broader community response? So that's really what I wanted to get at in this research. And what struck me is, given the huge ambiguity and uncertainty of the war in Donbass, that really problematizes the community's role and response for me, because there is so much uncertainty about all of these questions. And I think on the surface level, it seems like there's not. But when you start reading about it a little bit and talking to people, even just the terminology that we use to talk about the war, or that other, for example, Ukraine refers to it as the ATO, the anti-terrorist operation. For Russia, it's a civil war. For many in the West, it's a war of Russian aggression. It's a proxy war in the new Cold War between East and West. So there's all this conflicting terminology. There's also never actually been a declaration of war, and that changes a lot of things, not by either side. There is allegedly a peace process and a ceasefire, but that ceasefire is violated on a daily basis. So we have this peace process, but then we have reports of violence continuing on like nothing has happened in Minsk. So we have all these ambiguities surrounding the war, and I could go on with that list. Russian ambiguous or hybrid warfare. Russia, we don't even, there's not even full acknowledgement of who the enemy is in a lot of ways. And then there's these regional divisions in Ukraine. So are Ukrainians fighting other Ukrainians? Are Ukrainians fighting Russians? Are Ukrainians fighting a combination? So I think this really makes it problematic for the community to respond and provide that recognition and restitution, given how much uncertainty there is about the nature of the war itself. So the methodology for this was semi-structured interviews with service providers in Ukraine. So people that have created and implemented these psychosocial rehabilitation programs that are working directly with veterans. And I wanted to hear from them, where do they see the gap? The work that they're doing to ease the symptoms, how is that being supported or constrained by the community response? So we'll get into the findings now. First, I was able to identify several community understandings, and I wanted to put these quotes up because I wanted these people to speak for themselves a little bit and for you to hear, in their words, what they're seeing. And these are just a few of the representative examples. There's more nuance in the actual paper, a little bit more richness, but this is just to get at kind of the overview. So one is that the war was initially fought in large part by volunteers. And this perception has since changed, but a lot of people at the front lines relied on the community to come in and bring food and bring supplies to the front lines to help. And this created a perception when they returned that they were needy men who had nothing to eat or wear. This perception has gotten better, but in the early days of the war, the practitioners that are implementing these programs felt that this was something they really had to fight against, that these men really desperately needed the help of society. They were not these strong people fighting at the front lines. They were people that needed all this help. There was also a perception that, these guys just want to be, and I say guys, I'm just saying that for the sake of ease. There are definitely a lot of women involved, but a lot of these practitioners actually refer to them constantly as guys. They talk about the guys. So they would say that the guys are a killer of other Ukrainians because they'd see this this graffiti about them being fascists, then they would come back and they would find this weariness among the population with the war and with the broader reform process post-Maidan. And people would say to them, like, well, I didn't ask you to go to the war. Who are you fighting for? Are you fighting for Poroshenko? Are you fighting for those corrupt deputies in parliament? And that was really disempowering for them as well. And then again, as I mentioned before, there was a lot of frustration about Minsk, that these guys are under constant artillery fire, and yet the message that they're getting from the government is, yes, there's a peace process, yes, there's a ceasefire. So there's a real lack of communication, and it's built this trust issue with the government. Trauma through bureaucracy, probably the biggest issue that veterans are facing in terms of the community response is a lack of access to benefits that are contingent on combat veteran status, and a lack of quality of those benefits when they are actually able to access them. And a lot of points came up here. One was that they would hear before they left to come home, you're entitled to X, Y, and Z. And then they would go to the relevant government department to get their status and get their benefits. They would be passed off between different institutions. They would deal with rude attitudes, mountains of paperwork. They're already traumatized from war, and they're having to navigate this complicated system that the government's not making a great effort to explain to them. And they are being told, well, we don't know who you are, especially if they were a volunteer. You don't have status. The volunteers don't exist, so therefore you're not a combat veteran. Or I don't know why they told you that in your unit, that you can have those benefits. I've heard nothing about that here in my local office, so we can't get you those benefits. And finally, there was this hero soldiers, abuser alcoholic veterans, which is essentially just saying, soldiers have a really great perception in the media right now. They're heroes for Ukraine. They're sacrificing for Ukraine. But the image of veterans, people that have come back, is different. They're seen as substance abusers, wife beaters. There's all these stories in the press of all the consequences and the symptoms of PTSD, and nobody's really working on the image of veterans. And that's particularly true because they're only put in the reserves and they can be mobilized. So it's very difficult for them to just be veterans because they know that they can be called up again should the security situation deteriorate. Finally, there's somebody referred to it as the Wild West. There is a lot of superficial trainings. There's been so much interest in addressing trauma in Ukraine that a lot of organizations have come in, a lot of organizations have started. There's been no real quality control or evaluation mechanism between them. A lot of the grassroots organizations that began on the Maidan. And this has been great because they're able to, there's a sort of trauma bonding that goes on between Maidan activists and these soldiers in the East. And so they're really able to build trust with veterans, but there's a steep learning curve for people that were on the Maidan and started these psychosocial programs. So essentially, veterans are facing a very uncoordinated system of services, a steep learning curve, a lack of professionalism, and that's all getting better, but it feels definitely like the wild, wild west. So my conclusions, very quickly, yes, there are obvious deficiencies in the community response, and this is creating potential for re-traumatization of veterans. Some recommendations are to move from a relief to a developmental approach. All that really means is to start institutionalizing the system, not creating more programs to reinvent the wheel, but really seeing how we can integrate existing programs into broader European associations, build professional standards, make sure that these are sustainable programs. And Ukraine itself should double down on its commitment to reform so that when soldiers are returning, there's some sort of justification and some reason for them to have meaning for this work that they've done at the front lines. And just three points for future research. One is that I really think these findings should be expanded via comparative context. I think the American-Vietnam War could potentially be of interest here to see how psychosocial approaches were dealt with in a similarly uncertain war. Looking at psychiatric approaches, medical versus psychotherapeutic approaches, and variations there. And also looking at the difference between, for example, women's experiences, looking at mobilized soldiers versus volunteers, looking at soldiers returning to rural areas versus urban areas as well. So I'll stop there.